She looked down at the scuffed, dull leather loafers on the older woman's feet and let out a piercing, mocking laugh that turned the heads of several patrons in the upscale cafe. "Honestly," the younger woman sneered, flashing her shiny, red-bottomed designer heels, "if my husband was cheating on me, I'd at least try to look like I didn't buy my wardrobe from a dumpster. It's no wonder Christopher bought me a house." She thought she had won. She didn't know those dumpster shoes were a bespoke piece of history worth 5 times the mortgage of her newly acquired home. Penelope Wright understood a fundamental truth about wealth that most of the world never quite grasps. True money is completely silent. It does not need to shout. It does not need to flaunt logos, nor does it require the validation of strangers on the street. Penelope was the sole heiress to the Wright logistics and real estate empire, a staggering multi-generational fortune that had quietly built half the commercial skyline of Chicago over the past century. Yet, to look at her, you would assume she was a middle-class art teacher who enjoyed gardening and reading paperback novels on a modest porch. She lived by a strict code of stealth wealth. Her wardrobe consisted of unbranded cashmere, well-tailored but simple linen trousers, and accessories that were deeply personal rather than commercially recognizable. She drove a pristine, 10-year-old Volvo wagon. She did her own grocery shopping, and when she married Christopher Hastings 15 years ago, she made a conscious, heavily legally bound decision to keep the true extent of her net worth entirely hidden from him. Christopher was an account executive at a mid-tier advertising firm. He was charismatic, ambitious, and carried the specific kind of fragile ego that required him to feel like the sole provider. When they met, Penelope had introduced herself as a freelance consultant. She allowed Christopher to pay for their dates, allowed him to proudly secure the mortgage on their comfortable 4-bedroom suburban home, and allowed him to believe that his $140,000 a year salary was the bedrock of their existence. Penelope, behind the scenes, had her financial advisor, William Danforth, quietly pay off the mortgage entirely through a shell corporation, effectively making Christopher's monthly payments go into an investment fund under his own name. She loved him, and she wanted him to feel like the king of his castle. For over a decade, it worked. They were happy, or so Penelope thought. She spent her days managing her family's philanthropic trust, painting in her sunroom, and living a life of profound, unbothered peace. But Penelope's greatest indulgence, the one secret extravagance she allowed herself, was her footwear. Penelope had a profound appreciation for history and unparalleled craftsmanship. 3 years ago, at a highly exclusive invite-only Sotheby's auction in Geneva, Penelope had purchased a very specific pair of shoes. To the untrained, uncultured eye, they looked like a pair of heavily worn, scuffed brown leather loafers. The toes were slightly burnished, the leather looked deeply distressed, and the small, tarnished buckles across the vamp looked like dull brass. In reality, they were a masterpiece of historical preservation and covert luxury. The leather was extinct Russian calf, recovered from the wreck of the Frau Meta Katharina, a ship that sank off the coast of Cornwall in 1786. The unique tanning process, lost to history, gave the leather an aroma and durability that could never be replicated. The tarnished brass buckles were, in fact, crafted from a rare, naturally occurring alloy of platinum and rhodium, meticulously molded by a master jeweler in Florence. But the true secret of the shoes lay in the heels. Commissioned originally in the late 19th century by a European aristocrat seeking to smuggle wealth across borders, the hollowed-out wooden heel blocks contained a bespoke shock-absorbing compartment. Inside these compartments rested 2 flawless, 3-carat, vivid blue diamonds, the legendary tears of the Caspian. The shoes had been authenticated, insured and sold to Penelope for exactly $2.2 million. Penelope wore them almost daily. They were unimaginably comfortable, molding perfectly to her feet. She loved the profound irony of walking through a local supermarket wearing $2 million on her feet, while women dripping in heavily branded, mass-produced luxury goods gave her looks of polite pity. The scuffs on the leather were not signs of neglect. They were the natural, beautiful patina of a 200-year-old hide that had survived the bottom of the ocean. Christopher, of course, hated the shoes. "Penny, sweetheart," he had sighed one evening, adjusting his newly purchased Rolex, a watch Penelope knew he had financed on credit. "We're going to the firm's gala next week. Please tell me you're going to buy some new heels. You can't wear those beat-up brown slippers again. I'll give you my card. Go to Neiman Marcus. Get yourself something nice. I want my wife to look the part." Penelope had simply smiled, a warm, indulgent smile. "Christopher, these shoes are incredibly special to me. They're comfortable, and they have history. They look like they have the history of being dragged behind a truck," he muttered, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "I just got promoted to senior VP. I need to project an image of success. Those shoes project an image of, well, poverty." Penelope hadn't argued. She had simply worn a different pair of modest black pumps to the gala. She loved Christopher enough to compromise on the small things, but she had begun to notice a shift in him. The promotion to senior VP had acted as a catalyst, igniting a dormant vanity within her husband. He began spending an exorbitant amount of time at the gym. He started buying expensive tailored suits that stretched his salary to the breaking point. He became obsessed with image, a concept Penelope found thoroughly exhausting. She didn't know it yet, but Christopher's obsession with his new image was about to introduce a devastating new variable into their quiet lives. A variable named Tiffany Miller. Tiffany Miller was a woman constructed entirely of ambition, insecurity, and heavily applied contour makeup. At 28, she was a mid-level real estate agent who specialized in leasing luxury condos downtown. She drove a leased white Mercedes, carried a heavily logoed Louis Vuitton tote bag that she had purchased on a payment plan, and viewed life as a zero-sum game where value was solely determined by the visible price tags of one's possessions. She met Christopher at a corporate networking event. Christopher, buzzing on the high of his new title and wearing a sharp Tom Ford suit, caught her eye immediately. To Tiffany, Christopher represented the ultimate prize, an older, established, wealthy executive who could elevate her lifestyle from faking it to making it. To Christopher, Tiffany was an intoxicating mirror. She laughed at his jokes, she marveled at his business acumen, and most importantly, she validated his fragile new ego. Unlike Penelope, who treated his corporate achievements with mild, grounding affection, Tiffany treated him like a titan of industry. The affair began quickly and intensely. Christopher began working late. He started taking weekend business trips to nearby cities. Penelope, secure in her quiet life and deeply trusting of the man she had loved for 15 years, initially suspected nothing. She simply assumed the new vice president role was demanding. However, as the months bled on, the signs became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the late nights, it was the financial hemorrhaging. Because Penelope secretly paid the mortgage and most of the major bills, Christopher had a vast amount of disposable income. But suddenly, he was constantly stressed about money. He began asking Penelope to cover the utilities, claiming his money was tied up in aggressive stock options. Penelope, inherently observant, began to piece the puzzle together. She noticed the faint, cloying scent of cheap, overly sweet perfume on his collars. She found a receipt for a $3,000 diamond tennis bracelet stuffed in the pocket of his golf bag, a bracelet she never received. But the final irrefutable proof came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Penelope was managing the household mail. A thick envelope from a local title company had arrived, addressed to Christopher. Normally, Penelope respected his privacy, but the return address caught her eye. It was the same title company her family's real estate arm occasionally used for minor acquisitions. Believing it might be a bureaucratic error related to the house, she opened it. Inside was a copy of a finalized mortgage agreement for a pristine, newly constructed townhouse in an upscale gated community on the other side of the city. The purchase price was $450,000. Christopher Hastings was listed as the co-signer. The primary owner? Tiffany Miller. Penelope sat at her heavy oak kitchen table, the crisp legal documents resting in front of her, and felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. There were no tears. There was no screaming. The grief was there, certainly, a deep, hollow ache in her chest for the 15 years of loyalty she had given this man. But beneath the grief was a razor-sharp, inherited pragmatism. She was a Wright. Wrights did not throw tantrums. They engineered consequences. She picked up her phone and dialed William Danforth, her most trusted advisor. "William," Penelope said, her voice steady and smooth, "I need you to freeze the secondary investment account. The one Christopher believes is his retirement fund." "Is everything all right, Penelope?" William asked, his tone instantly shifting to high alert. "Christopher has purchased a house for his mistress," she replied, staring at the name Tiffany Miller on the contract. "I want a full background check on her by tomorrow morning. I also want you to draw up the divorce papers, cite infidelity. And William?" "Yes, Penelope. Ensure the ironclad prenup is attached to the front page. He leaves with exactly what he brought into this marriage, which is to say, his wardrobe and his golf clubs." While Penelope meticulously planned the dismantling of her marriage, Tiffany Miller was growing impatient. Tiffany was tired of being the secret. She wanted Christopher to leave his frumpy, boring wife and make their relationship public. Christopher, terrified of the financial implications of a divorce, ironically, fearing he would lose half of his hard-earned assets to Penelope, kept stalling. Tiffany decided to force his hand. She began actively trying to leave clues. She left a bright red lipstick tube in the passenger side of his car. She purposely sprayed her perfume on his suit jacket. And finally, she decided it was time to step out of the shadows and mark her territory directly. Through some light online stalking, Tiffany had figured out Penelope's routine. She knew that every Thursday afternoon, Penelope visited an exclusive quiet patisserie called Le Petit Palais in the city's arts district to read and enjoy a pot of Earl Grey tea. Tiffany, armed with her brand-new, bright red Christian Louboutin heels, purchased on Christopher's credit card, and a fresh blowout, decided to introduce herself. She wanted to look the wife in the eye. She wanted to see the pathetic, plain woman Christopher complained about. She wanted to humiliate her, assert her dominance, and drive the final wedge into the Hastings marriage. Le Petit Palais was an oasis of understated elegance. Sunlight streamed through the large arched windows, illuminating the rich mahogany tables and casting a warm glow over the glass cases filled with delicate French pastries. Penelope sat in her usual corner booth, a first-edition copy of a Hemingway novel resting on the table next to her steaming teapot. She was dressed comfortably, as always. She wore a pair of perfectly tailored, wide-leg beige linen trousers, a simple cream-colored silk blouse, and on her feet the $2.2 million distressed Russian calf leather loafers. She was currently reviewing the background check William Danforth had sent over that morning regarding Tiffany Miller. The file was tragically predictable. Maxed out credit cards, 2 defaulted car loans, and a desperate, scrambling history of dating moderately wealthy men to sustain an illusion of grandeur. Penelope actually felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity for the girl. It must be exhausting to perform your worth for the world every single day. The bell above the cafe door chimed aggressively. Penelope didn't look up immediately, but she heard the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of high heels striking the marble floor. The footsteps were purposeful, moving directly toward her corner. "Penelope Hastings," a voice demanded. The tone was nasal, slightly shrill, and dripping with manufactured confidence. Penelope slowly marked her page in the book, closed the file folder discreetly, and looked up. Standing before her was the woman from the photographs. Tiffany Miller looked exactly as Penelope had expected. She was wearing a skin-tight designer dress that was perhaps 2 seasons out of date, but covered in recognizable logos. Her makeup was flawless, but heavy, and she was glaring down at Penelope with an expression of triumphant disdain. "I am Penelope," she replied, her voice soft, modulated, and entirely unbothered. "Can I help you?" Tiffany let out a short, breathy laugh, and unceremoniously slid into the booth opposite Penelope, completely uninvited. She crossed her legs dramatically, ensuring the iconic red soles of her stilettos were visible. "I'm Tiffany," she said, leaning forward, "though I imagine you probably already know who I am. Christopher talks about me constantly, even when he's supposed to be at home with you." Penelope picked up her teacup, her hand perfectly steady. She took a slow sip, savoring the bergamot, before setting it gently back on the saucer. She looked Tiffany directly in the eyes. "Tiffany." "Yes, the real estate agent," Penelope said mildly. "I understand Christopher recently helped you secure a mortgage on a townhouse in Oak Brook. Congratulations on the new property. The interest rates are quite punishing right now." Tiffany blinked, momentarily derailed by Penelope's absolute lack of emotional reaction. This wasn't how the script in her head was supposed to play out. Penelope was supposed to gasp, or cry, or cause a scene. Instead, she was making polite conversation about interest rates. Anger flashed in Tiffany's eyes. She needed to draw blood. She needed to feel superior. She looked Penelope up and down, her lip curling in a pronounced sneer. "You know, Christopher told me you let yourself go," Tiffany spat, her voice rising in volume, drawing the gaze of a few nearby tables. "He told me you had no sense of style, no ambition, but seeing you in person, it's actually worse than I imagined." Penelope simply watched her, her expression akin to a biologist observing a particularly loud, frantic insect. Tiffany leaned back, gesturing broadly at Penelope's attire. "Look at you. You're his wife, for God's sake. He's a senior VP, and you're sitting in a place like this, looking like a librarian who shopped at a thrift store." Tiffany's eyes trailed down beneath the table, landing on Penelope's feet. A vicious, genuine smile broke across her face. This was her angle of attack. "Oh my God!" Tiffany laughed loudly, pointing a manicured finger at Penelope's feet. "Are you kidding me? Are those your shoes?" Penelope did not pull her feet back. She looked down at the priceless, historical leather loafers. "They are. They look like they belong in a dumpster," Tiffany shrieked, clearly playing to the audience of the cafe now. "They're scuffed. They're dull. They look like you found them on a dead homeless man. Honestly, if my husband was cheating on me, I'd at least try to look like I didn't buy my wardrobe from the garbage." Tiffany proudly lifted her foot, tapping her $1,200 stiletto against the leg of the table. These are Louboutins. They cost more than your entire, sad, frumpy wardrobe combined. Christopher bought them for me, just like he bought me that house, because I actually take care of myself. I know my worth." Penelope remained utterly still. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The few patrons who had been watching now looked deeply uncomfortable, expecting a massive blowout. Instead, Penelope let out a soft, genuine sigh. It wasn't a sigh of defeat. It was a sigh of profound weariness. "Tiffany," Penelope began, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a sudden, commanding weight that made the younger woman freeze. "Do you know what the true tragedy of your existence is?" Tiffany opened her mouth to snap back, but Penelope held up a single, manicured finger, commanding silence with a terrifyingly quiet authority. "You believe that a price tag you can read is the only measure of value," Penelope continued, her eyes locking onto Tiffany's with the intensity of a predator. "You flaunt those shoes, mass-produced in a factory, bought on a credit card with an 18% interest rate, and you believe they make you superior. You brag about a $450,000 townhouse, unaware of how very, very small that pond is." Tiffany's confidence faltered slightly. She crossed her arms defensively. "You're just jealous because Christopher chose me." Penelope smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Christopher didn't choose you, Tiffany. Christopher chose a mirror that tells him he is a giant. He is a profoundly insecure man who makes $140,000 a year, which he is currently squandering to impress you." Penelope slowly leaned forward, bridging the distance across the table. "And as for my shoes..." Penelope shifted her feet slightly. The subtle movement caught the afternoon light, causing a microscopic flash from the hidden platinum buckles. "You see scuffed leather," Penelope said softly. "I see extinct Russian calf, hide from 1786. You see dull buckles. I see custom-forged platinum. And what you cannot see, buried inside the heels of these dumpster shoes, are two flawless blue diamonds that once belonged to the Roman family." Tiffany stared at her, her mouth slightly open, a look of sheer, confused disbelief washing over her heavily contoured face. You're insane. You're making that up." "These shoes, Tiffany," Penelope whispered, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel, "are insured for $2.2 million. I am wearing 5 of your mortgaged townhouses on my feet. And unlike Christopher, I actually own them." Tiffany let out a nervous, derisive scoff. "Right. Sure. The frumpy housewife is secretly a billionaire. If you have so much money, why the hell does Christopher pay for everything?" "Christopher pays for nothing," Penelope corrected, her voice turning completely glacial. "I own the house you think he pays for. I own the cars. I even, through a labyrinth of corporate structuring that your brain couldn't possibly comprehend, own the firm that just promoted him. I let him play house. I let him feel important. And now he has broken the rules of my game." Penelope reached into her leather handbag, pulled out a crisp, heavy stock envelope, and slid it across the table toward Tiffany. "What is this?" Tiffany asked, her voice suddenly trembling, the bravado entirely evaporated. "That is a copy of Christopher's termination letter from his firm, effective at 5 o'clock this afternoon," Penelope stated. "Beneath it is a copy of the divorce filing, which includes a motion to seize all assets purchased with marital funds, including, my dear, the down payment on your new home and the very shoes you are currently tapping against my table." Penelope stood up, smoothing the front of her linen trousers. She looked down at Tiffany, who was now staring at the documents with wide, terrified eyes. "You wanted to mark your territory, Tiffany," Penelope said, her tone devoid of any emotion. "You wanted to ensure I knew exactly what you had taken from me. Well, Congratulations. You have him. You have a 45-year-old unemployed man who is about to be drowning in legal fees and debt. He is entirely yours. I hope he was worth it. Penelope picked up her book, dropped a crisp $100 bill on the table to cover her tea, and turned toward the exit. Oh, and Tiffany? Penelope paused, looking back over her shoulder. She glanced down at the scuffed, $2.2 million historical masterpieces on her feet. Take care of those red bottoms. You're going to need to sell them to make your next mortgage payment. With that, Penelope Wright walked out of Le Petit Palais, her footsteps completely silent against the marble, leaving her husband's mistress sitting alone in the wreckage of her own ambition. Christopher Hastings stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, gazing out at the Chicago skyline. At 45, he felt he had finally conquered the world. His tailored charcoal suit draped perfectly over his shoulders, his newly acquired Rolex Daytona felt heavy and commanding on his left wrist, and his promotion to senior vice president at Meridian Horizon, one of the city's top-tier marketing firms, was the ultimate validation of his genius. He took a sip of his espresso and checked his phone. It was 3:15 p.m. He had a reservation at the Capitol Grill tonight with Tiffany to celebrate the closing of her new townhouse. Life was a seamless, upward trajectory. He briefly thought of Penelope, likely at home pruning her hydrangeas or reading some dusty biography, and felt a pang of smug pity. She was a good woman, but she lacked his drive. She was static. He was kinetic. A sharp knock on the glass door shattered his reverie. Before he could answer, Brenda Hopkins, the firm's stern director of human resources, walked in. She wasn't alone. Flanking her were two men in dark suits, whom Christopher recognized as the building's private security contractors. Brenda? Christopher frowned, setting his espresso down. I don't have a meeting scheduled with you. And what's with the muscle? Brenda did not smile. She approached his mahogany desk and placed a single, impeccably typed document on the center blotter. Christopher, please sit down, Brenda said, her voice devoid of its usual corporate warmth. I prefer to stand, he replied, his heart suddenly performing a strange, irregular thud against his ribs. What is this? As of 3:10 p.m. today, your employment at Meridian Horizon has been terminated, effective immediately, Brenda stated, folding her hands in front of her. The board has executed the at-will termination clause in your contract. Christopher let out a loud, incredulous laugh. Terminated? Brenda, I was promoted 3 months ago. I brought in the Vanguard account. You can't fire me. I need to speak to the CEO. Get Harrison on the phone right now. Mr. Cole is unavailable, Brenda replied smoothly, and he is fully aware of the situation. You are instructed to hand over your company phone, your corporate credit card, and your key card. Security will escort you to the exit. We will mail your personal effects to your legal residence. My severance? There is no severance, Christopher, Brenda interrupted, her eyes narrowing slightly. You are being dismissed under the moral turpitude and gross misconduct clauses, following a direct mandate from the primary shareholders. I suggest you read the termination packet carefully. Now your phone and keys, please. Dazed, Christopher emptied his pockets. His mind was reeling. A mandate from the primary shareholders? Meridian Horizon was a private firm. He didn't even know who the primary financial backers were. The walk to the elevator was the longest of his life. The entire floor had gone deathly silent. Junior executives he had berated yesterday were now staring at him from their cubicles with wide, fascinated eyes as he was marched out by security like a common thief. When he reached the underground parking garage, the chilly dampness of the concrete finally snapped him out of his shock. He climbed into his leased BMW 5 Series, his hands shaking violently as he gripped the leather steering wheel. This was a mistake, a massive bureaucratic error. He needed to call his lawyer. He needed to call Tiffany. He reached for his personal cell phone and dialed his bank. If he was going to fight this, he needed to know his war chest was secure. He had over $300,000 in his primary investment account, the money he had saved by not paying the mortgage all these years. "Welcome to Chase Private Client," the automated voice purred. After a frantic navigation of menus, a representative answered. "Yes, my name is Christopher Hastings. I need to check the available balance on my primary investment portfolio." "One moment, Mr. Hastings," the representative said. There was a pause, filled with soft jazz music that made Christopher want to scream. "Sir, I'm looking at your profile now. It appears your primary account, as well as your checking and savings accounts, have been frozen." "Frozen?" Christopher barked, his face turning crimson. "By who? On what authority?" "By a court order, sir," the representative replied calmly. "An emergency injunction was filed 2 hours ago by the primary account holder, the Wright Family Trust, citing dissipation of marital assets. You will need to contact the trust's legal representation, Danforth, Hightower, and Reed, for further information." The phone slipped from Christopher's sweaty palm, clattering into the passenger seat. The Wright Family Trust. Penelope's maiden name was Wright, but that was impossible. Penelope was a freelance consultant. She painted watercolors. She drove a decade-old Volvo. She wore scuffed brown shoes. There was no trust. There was no wealth. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. He threw the car into drive and sped out of the garage, breaking several traffic laws as he raced toward his suburban home. He needed to see Penelope. He needed to explain, to apologize, to figure out what kind of insane financial web she had secretly spun. He pulled into the driveway, his tires screeching against the pavement. The house was dark. He rushed up the front steps and jammed his key into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. He tried again, rattling the doorknob violently. The locks had been changed. It was then that he noticed the neat stack of 4 large, heavy-duty black trash bags sitting on the porch swing. Taped to the top bag was a thick manila envelope bearing his name, written in Penelope's elegant, sweeping cursive. Christopher tore the envelope open. Inside was a legal document. Notice of filing for divorce. Petitioner, Penelope Wright Hastings. Respondent, Christopher Hastings. Attached to the front was a highlighted copy of the prenuptial agreement he had signed 15 years ago. He remembered that day clearly. Penelope had handed it to him over coffee, apologizing for the formality, claiming her uncle insisted on it to protect a small inherited piece of farmland in Indiana. Christopher, eager to prove he wasn't after her, non-existent, he thought, money, had signed it without even giving it to a lawyer. He read the highlighted text now, his vision blurring. Respondent waives all rights to spousal support, alimony, and any claim to assets held under the Wright Family Trust, its subsidiaries, holdings, and real estate acquisitions. In the event of dissolution due to infidelity, respondent forfeits all mutually acquired marital assets to the petitioner to cover damages. Beneath the legal jargon was a small, handwritten note on a piece of monogrammed stationery. "Christopher, I hope the new promotion was worth the price of admission. Your golf clubs are in the 3rd bag. Do not attempt to contact me. My lawyers will handle everything from here." He was locked out. He was broke. He was unemployed. Trembling, Christopher pulled his phone back out and dialed the only lifeline he had left. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. "Tiffany?" Christopher gasped, leaning against the locked front door of the house he thought he owned. "Tiff, baby, something insane is happening. I need to come over to your place. Right now." On the other end of the line, Tiffany Miller let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "Don't you dare come near my house, Christopher!" she shrieked, her voice echoing with a manic terror he had never heard before. "Don't you dare!" Christopher didn't listen. 40 minutes later, he was pounding his fists against the freshly painted hunter green door of Tiffany's upscale Oakbrook townhouse. The rain had started to fall, a cold, relentless Chicago drizzle that soaked through his Tom Ford suit, plastering his hair to his forehead. "Tiffany, open the door!" he yelled, glancing nervously at the neighbor's windows, where curtains were already beginning to twitch. The deadbolt clicked and the door flew open. Tiffany stood in the entryway, looking like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. Her usually flawless blowout was a tangled mess. Her heavy makeup had run down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks, ruining the collar of her designer silk robe. In her right hand, she clutched a half-empty bottle of Sauvignon Blanc by the neck. "I told you not to come here!" she screamed, her chest heaving. She didn't step back to let him in. She stood, blocking the threshold like a cornered animal. "Tiff, calm down," Christopher pleaded, pushing past her into the foyer. The house was a disaster. Cardboard moving boxes were half unpacked, but mixed among them were piles of legal documents, printed emails, and bank statements scattered across the hardwood floor. In the center of the living room, one of her prized, red-bottomed Christian Louboutin heels lay snapped in half, clearly thrown against the wall in a fit of rage. "Calm down," Tiffany laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bordered on hysterical. She slammed the front door shut. "You want me to calm down? I just got a call from the title company, Christopher. The check for the down payment on this house bounced. It bounced because the funds were frozen, and then I checked my credit cards, the ones you pay for. Declined. Every single one of them." I know, Christopher said, holding his hands up defensively. He paced the living room, leaving wet footprints on the expensive Persian rug. "It's Penelope. She's gone crazy. She filed some kind of fraudulent injunction. She locked me out of the house. She even got me fired. I don't know how she did it, but she contacted HR at Meridian." "She didn't contact HR, you absolute idiot!" Tiffany shrieked, hurling the wine bottle. It smashed against the brick fireplace, sending shards of green glass and pale wine flying across the hearth. Christopher flinched, staring at her in shock. "What are you talking about?" Tiffany marched up to him, jabbing a trembling finger into his chest. "She owns it! She owns Meridian Horizon! She owns the building you worked in. She owns the title company that processed this house. She owns everything, Christopher." "That's impossible," Christopher scoffed, though the memory of Brenda Hopkins mentioning primary shareholders flashed chillingly in his mind. "Penelope is a freelance consultant. She clips coupons, Tiffany. She buys her clothes at outlet malls. She drives a 10-year-old Volvo." "It's a disguise," Tiffany wailed, grabbing fistfuls of her own hair. "I met her. I went to that stupid little cafe she goes to in the arts district. I was going to humiliate her. I was going to tell her about us and make her feel like trash." Christopher felt his stomach drop out. You went to see Penelope? Why would you do that?" "Because you wouldn't leave her," Tiffany screamed. "But it didn't matter. She already knew. She had this file on me. And then I made fun of her shoes. Those ugly, scuffed brown shoes she always wears." Christopher blinked, utterly confused by the detour in the conversation. "Her loafers? What do her shoes have to do with anything?" Tiffany looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "Christopher, those shoes are made of extinct Russian leather. They have platinum buckles. There are diamonds hidden inside the heels. She told me they are insured for $2.2 million. $2 million, Christopher. On her feet. You're insane, Christopher whispered, backing away from her. She's playing you. She's lying. Is she? A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the chaos of the living room. Christopher and Tiffany both whipped around. Standing in the open archway of the kitchen, having let himself in through the unlocked back patio door, was a tall, distinguished man in his late 60s. He wore a bespoke three-piece suit and carried a sleek, black leather briefcase. "Who the hell are you?" Christopher demanded. "My name is William Danforth," the man said smoothly, stepping into the living room. He did not look at Tiffany. His eyes were fixed entirely on Christopher. "I am the chief legal counsel and financial manager for the Wright Family Trust. And I assure you, Mr. Hastings, Penelope does not lie. The shoes are, in fact, a verified historical artifact recovered from the Frau Meta Katharina. I arranged the insurance policy myself following the Sotheby's auction." Christopher's legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto Tiffany's newly purchased velvet sofa, staring at the lawyer. "The Wright Family Trust? That's Penelope?" "Penelope is the sole heir and controlling beneficiary of an estate valued at roughly $4.8 billion, Danforth stated, his tone as casual as if he were reading the weather report. "She allowed you to believe you were the provider because she loved you, and she understood your delicate ego. She orchestrated your life, Mr. Hastings, right down to secretly paying off the mortgage on the house you thought you were financing." "The money in my investment account," Christopher stammered. "Was her money," Danforth confirmed, "rerouted to give you a sense of accomplishment, money which you subsequently attempted to use to purchase this property for your mistress." Danforth finally glanced at Tiffany, his lip curling slightly in distaste. Danforth set his briefcase on the coffee table, popped the golden latches, and extracted 2 thick folders. He tossed one onto Christopher's lap and handed the other to Tiffany. "These are your copies of the asset forfeiture injunctions," Danforth explained. "Mr. Hastings, per the prenuptial agreement you signed, you leave this marriage with the exact net worth you brought into it 15 years ago, which, adjusted for inflation, is approximately $12,000 and a used vehicle." Danforth turned to Tiffany. "Ms. Miller, because marital funds were illegally used to initiate the purchase of this property, the Wright Trust has seized the down payment. The mortgage is null and void. The bank owns this townhouse again. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before the police arrive to escort you out." "You can't do this," Tiffany sobbed, sinking to her knees on the floor. "I have nothing. I owe $60,000 on my credit cards." "I suggest you return the luxury goods you purchased on Mr. Hastings's dime," Danforth replied coldly. "Though, looking at that broken shoe, I doubt you'll get full retail value." Danforth snapped his briefcase shut and walked toward the front door. He paused with his hand on the brass knob, looking back at the utterly ruined couple. "Penelope wanted me to pass along one final message," Danforth said, his voice echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the room. "She said to tell you both that true wealth doesn't need to shout to be heard, but when it finally decides to speak, it always has the final word." The door clicked shut, leaving Christopher Hastings sitting in his soaking wet suit, realizing that the woman he thought was a peasant was actually the queen of the board, and he had just willingly walked right off the edge of it. For 10 agonizing minutes after William Danforth walked out the door, neither Christopher nor Tiffany spoke. The silence in the half-unpacked townhouse was absolute, broken only by the sound of the Chicago rain lashing relentlessly against the large picture windows. Christopher sat frozen on the velvet sofa, his expensive charcoal suit soaking wet and clinging uncomfortably to his skin. His mind was a chaotic, spinning vortex. $4.8 billion, The number echoed in his skull, completely incomprehensible. He thought of all the times he had belittled Penelope's spending habits, all the times he had proudly handed her a few $100s to buy groceries, feeling like the magnanimous provider. She had been playing a character. She had let him play the king while she quietly owned the entire kingdom. Tiffany finally broke the silence. She didn't cry. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of pure survivalist rage. She marched over to the front door, yanked it open, and pointed a trembling, manicured finger out into the storm. "Get out!" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. Christopher looked up, blinking as if waking from a coma. "Tiff, babe, wait. We can figure this out. I can call a lawyer. We can fight the injunction." "Fight the injunction!" Tiffany shrieked, kicking a cardboard box full of decorative pillows across the foyer. "With what money, Christopher? You heard the lawyer. You have $12,000. I owe $60,000 on credit cards because I bought into your pathetic, fake lifestyle. You are a fraud." "Me?" Christopher stood up, his own anger suddenly flaring to mask his terror. "You're the one who demanded the new house. You're the one who couldn't stop bleeding my accounts dry for designer garbage. I lost my job, my wife, and my entire life for you." Tiffany let out a bitter, mocking laugh that sounded like tearing metal. "You didn't lose your life for me. You lost it because you're a narcissistic idiot who didn't even know who he was married to. I wanted a senior vice president. I wanted a man who could take care of me. What I got was a kept man who just got cut off by his sugar mummy. Get out of my house." "It's the bank's house now," Christopher spat maliciously, adjusting his wet jacket. "Enjoy the eviction." He walked out into the rain, the heavy green door slamming behind him with a finality that rattled his bones. His leased BMW was still parked in the driveway. He got in, shivering violently, and turned the key. The dashboard lit up, but his phone immediately buzzed. It was an automated text from the dealership. "Your payment method on file has been declined. Please update your billing information immediately to avoid vehicle repossession." He drove away, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. He had nowhere to go. He couldn't go back to her house in the suburbs. He ended up pulling into the parking lot of a cheap, neon-lit motel on the outskirts of the city. He paid for a week up front using the last remaining cash he had squirreled away in a hidden emergency envelope in his glove box. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach. Christopher sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper, and finally broke down. He wept for his lost prestige, his lost corner office, and his shattered ego. The next morning, Christopher began the frantic scramble to salvage his existence. He put on his wrinkled suit and started making calls. His first call was to a prominent divorce attorney he had once played golf with. "Listen, Chris." The attorney sighed heavily over the phone after Christopher explained the situation. "I know the Wright family trust. Everyone in corporate law knows the Wright family trust. They own half the commercial real estate in the Midwest. If William Danforth drafted that prenup, it's not just airtight. It's cast in titanium. If I take your case, Danforth's firm will bury me in injunctions until I'm disbarred. I'm sorry, man." You signed the paperwork. Every lawyer in the city gave him a variation of the same answer. He was legally radioactive. Next, he tried to tap into his professional network. He called the junior executives he had mentored, the clients he had wined and dined, the industry peers who had slapped him on the back just a week ago. Nobody answered. Word had spread through the Chicago corporate grapevine with terrifying speed. Christopher Hastings hadn't just been fired, He had been excommunicated by the very forces that silently funded their industry. He was blacklisted. Within a month, the reality of his new life set in. His BMW was repossessed in the middle of the night from the motel parking lot. His custom-tailored suits began to hang loosely on his frame as he started skipping meals to stretch his rapidly dwindling $12,000 settlement. Meanwhile, Tiffany's descent was equally brutal, albeit much louder. Refusing to accept her new reality, she attempted to sell her collection of designer bags and shoes to high-end consignment boutiques. It was a humiliating awakening. The boutiques meticulously inspected her items, revealing that several of the pieces she had purchased through shady online resellers to save money were in fact high-quality counterfeits. The authentic pieces she did possess, including the infamous red-bottomed heels she had flaunted at Penelope, were offered mere fractions of their retail value due to heavy wear and tear. Facing immediate eviction and hounded by aggressive debt collectors, Tiffany was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom in her parents' cramped, heavily mortgaged suburban home. Her real estate license was suspended after the title company reported her for attempting to secure a mortgage using legally frozen assets. The last Christopher heard through a mutual acquaintance, Tiffany had taken a job spraying perfume samples at a mid-tier department store in the suburbs, wearing generic black flats because her feet couldn't handle heels anymore. But Christopher couldn't afford to gloat over Tiffany's misery. He was too busy drowning in his own. 8 months later, the bitter Chicago winter had thawed into a crisp, promising spring. Christopher Hastings stood under the grand, brass-trimmed awning of the Wellington Club, the city's most exclusive private dining establishment. He was wearing a stiff polyester uniform consisting of black trousers, a white shirt, and a dark green vest with a gold name tag pinned to the lapel that read, Chris, Valet. It was the only job he could find that paid cash tips, which he desperately needed to cover the rent for his cramped, windowless basement apartment on the south side. The physical labor was exhausting, but the psychological torture was infinitely worse. Every night, he parked the Porsches, Mercedes, and Bentleys of the men he used to share boardrooms with. He learned to keep his head down, averting his eyes, praying the shadows of the awning would hide his face from his former peers. Inside the club, on the top floor overlooking the glittering skyline, Penelope Wright sat at the head of a massive antique mahogany dining table. She looked exactly the same as she always had. She wore a simple, beautifully cut navy blue wool blazer over a pristine white silk blouse. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant, effortless clasp. She did not wear heavily branded jewelry, nor did she wear aggressive makeup, but the energy around her had fundamentally shifted. Penelope was no longer playing the role of the quiet, suburban housewife. Following the swift surgical execution of her divorce, she had officially stepped out of the shadows and assumed her rightful position as the active chairwoman of the Wright Family Trust. Sitting around the table were 12 of the most powerful CEOs, developers, and politicians in the state. They were hanging onto her every word. The acquisition of the South Loop properties will proceed as planned, Penelope said, her voice smooth, measured, and projecting absolute authority. However, we will be allocating 20% of the newly developed commercial space to subsidized low-rent incubators for local, minority-owned businesses. That is a non-negotiable term of the Trust's continued investment. The men around the table nodded vigorously, making quick notes in their leather-bound portfolios. Nobody argued with Penelope Wright. She wielded her family's immense wealth with a terrifyingly precise, almost surgical grace. As the meeting concluded, William Danforth approached her side, handing her a sleek black coat. "An excellent meeting, Penelope," Danforth murmured. The market will respond very favorably to the South Loop initiative tomorrow morning. Thank you, William. Penelope smiled warmly. I believe it's time to head home. I have a new canvas I'm quite eager to start painting. Down on the street level, the rain had begun to fall again, slicking the cobblestone driveway of the Wellington Club. Christopher shivered, pulling his thin valet jacket tighter around his chest. He checked his cheap plastic wristwatch. It was almost midnight. His shift was nearly over. A sleek, heavily armored, midnight blue Maybach glided silently to a halt under the awning. Christopher immediately stepped forward, pulling his umbrella open. He recognized the car. It belonged to the Wright family trust. He had parked it a few times for the executives who dined here, but he had never seen the primary owner. His heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The driver, a burly man in a sharp suit, stepped out and gave Christopher a curt nod, tossing him the heavy silver key fob. "Keep it close. She's coming down now." Christopher's breath hitched in his throat. He froze, standing rigidly at attention next to the rear passenger door, holding the umbrella high. The heavy brass-studded doors of the club opened. Penelope Wright walked out into the cool night air, flanked respectfully by the club's general manager and William Danforth. Christopher stared at her. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked completely at peace. The realization of what he had thrown away for a cheap, plastic imitation of success hit him with the physical force of a freight train. He wanted to speak. He wanted to fall to his knees on the wet cobblestones and beg for her forgiveness, to tell her he understood now that he was sorry. As Penelope approached the car, she paused. She looked directly at the valet, holding the umbrella. For a fraction of a second, her eyes locked onto Christopher's. There was no anger in her gaze. There was no triumph, no malice, and certainly no pity. There was only the calm, detached recognition one might give a stranger they passed on a crowded sidewalk. She broke the eye contact smoothly, looking down as she stepped toward the open door of the Maybach. Christopher's eyes followed her movement, looking down at the wet pavement. There, stepping gracefully into the luxurious interior of the car, were the shoes. The scuffed, dull brown leather loafers. The 200-year-old extinct Russian calf hide. The custom platinum buckles, slightly tarnished, catching the dim glow of the street lamps. The shoes that contained 2 flawless blue diamonds, hidden within their heels. The $2.2 million masterpiece that had brought down his entire world. Penelope settled into the plush leather seat. Without looking at him again, she reached into her handbag, pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill, and held it out the window. Christopher's hand trembled as he reached out and took the money from his ex-wife. "Thank you," Penelope said softly, her voice carrying over the sound of the rain. The tinted window rolled up silently. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the glittering, wet streets of the city she owned, leaving Christopher Hastings, standing alone in the rain, gripping a $100 bill, finally understanding the true, deafening sound of silent wealth. Did Penelope's brilliant, icy revenge leave you absolutely speechless? This story proves that true wealth whispers, while crippling insecurity screams. Christopher and Tiffany learned the hard way that chasing a facade will only leave you with a shattered reflection, while real power moves in total silence. If you loved this story of brutal karma and stealth wealth, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder about the true value of loyalty. And subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Penelope?